All right, so we are sitting down today with Dr. Christopher Dreyer. Um, uh, Doctor, thank you so much for being with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me to be on your podcast.
Absolutely. So, if you wouldn't mind, just for the audience, just giving us a feel for what your job looks like, what your everyday looks like.
Yeah, the everyday nowadays is a little different from what it was months ago.
I imagine so.
Yeah, but I'm a professor at the Colorado School of Mines in our Space Resources program. It's a program that focuses on how to use the resources of space, how to discover them, then make use of them, and the things we would use them for. Um, and this is something I've been doing for the last few years. Kind of been a member of kind of the space resources community, doing research in technology primarily for use of space resources for about 10 to 15 years. Um, my background is as a mechanical engineer, and that's what brought me to the Colorado School of Mines, and then that developed in time into this space resources focus. About 2 years ago, the School of Mines created this program, and we have three faculty members in the program, and we are continually expanding. We have over 100 students taking courses in our program. All of them are in graduate school, so it's a graduate program with post baccalaureate certificate, a master's, a non-thesis master's degree, and PhD. We teach entirely online. There are courses our students take on campus as well, but we're structured around it being online, and that was what it was from the beginning a couple years ago. So now with the COVID-19 situation, we are easily transitioning for the fall into fully online courses because it's what it is.
I was going to say it's probably much easier for you guys having the infrastructure there already.
Right, yeah, and our university has been moving quickly into online over the last couple years, and or the current situation has accelerated the plans for that.
Very interesting. Hope that's all going relatively smoothly.
Well, we'll see how the fall shakes out. I'm sure
Right.
for the Space Resources program, it'll really will have little impact. For the rest of the university, it's really we'll have to see how undergraduate courses go, particularly.
Right.
But yeah.
So, depending on how serious you are about this quarantine, somewhat related. Uh, just to hit you off with the hardball right off the bat, because of course, will we see a Martian colony within 50 years? Do you think, given what you're teaching these students currently, where you see the research is at, and what actually currently exists? Could you maybe give us a timeline, or is that just way too far out there?
No, yeah, everyone likes a timeline.
Right.
Well, it does depend on what you mean by a colony. Within 50 years, I think we will have many people on Mars. I think when we whether it would be I know we've talked there's people talking about 1 million people on Mars in 50 years. I don't think we can quite reach that level. Um, but we can reach thousands or tens of thousands. What we teach in the program is about in for the for the expansion of humanity into space, it will be necessary for us to use resources. It's
Mm-hmm.
kind of an obvious thing. We don't when we everywhere on Earth we are using local resources. But we've also developed on Earth an ability to transport materials all across the planet. So you could have food grown in South America that's shipped to North America. You have materials that could be manufactured anywhere in the world and shipped all over the world. I just ordered something the other day that's shipping from India, and that's common today. So the no, but in space there's a big gap between the Earth and everything in space due to just orbital mechanics and rocketry that suggest you have to use the resources in space, and you're essentially using everything you need needs to be found where you're living. Um, yeah, and actually, I guess we could talk about this. One thing we made a conscious decision in the beginning to call it space resources as opposed to say space mining.
Mm.
Um, and a reason for that is mining itself is one step in the process. Before mining, there's exploration. After mining, there's manufacturing. And in fact, there's other steps in the process afterwards in terms of use. And how you would use a resource also impacts how you're going to acquire it, where you acquire it from, and how you process it. So we view the kind of field as an interrelated series of questions about the knowledge about the resources that are present, the technologies you need to acquire them and use them, and the ways in which you would use them. And then there's related things in terms of the legality of all of this and the
Mm.
social and economic impacts of this. The other piece is that we make you're interested in this kind of exploration of space for the purpose of people living permanently in space, or um, one could call that colonization, but there's also a reason to say maybe we can find a new term rather than colonization. But
Mm.
um, there's also the mining of space to return things to Earth for sale. I'm involved in some asteroid mining concepts, or one particular asteroid mining concept, and we're really focusing there on use of resources in space, particularly water. But there is also with asteroid mining the discussion of metals being mined in space to return to Earth and be sold for massive profits. And there should be serious caution to say whether
Right.
any of that is really feasible. Use of resources in space to sustain and enable new things in space is entirely feasible. There might be a future in which we mine things in space to return to Earth, maybe even manufacture things in space to make a better iPhone. Um, but that is quite difficult to predict. It's much easier to predict the kind of cities on Mars than for me than to make a business case that today clearly works for returning things to Earth at a profit.
Is automation one of those technologies that is like necessary to make this a reality?
Yes, I might kind of broaden that a little bit, and it depends on how narrow you think of automation, but or how broad you think of it. I would broaden it to say robotics and kind of truly autonomous robotics. In our if you look at how we would likely use resources and build the technologies for it, a lot of it should be fully robotic, with human tending or humans in the loop kind of in monitoring the system. But it doesn't, in many cases, it doesn't make sense for people to be actively at the mine site or driving a vehicle to actively mine. They might be more in a supervisory role, monitoring robots that are doing the work.
Mhm. What was it? What would you say was the sort of inciting action, the thing that sort of kicked you into overdrive into the field that you're in now? What got you interested?
Well, for me, from a young age, I wanted to do something in space, related to working and doing things in space.
Mhm.
Um, and I had pretty much taken the approach that I would get a good education and then actively seek out the most interesting things I could do. And that eventually led me to the Colorado School of Mines to work in a center we had at the time that was focused on studying combustion in space. Like using microgravity to better understand combustion, and also some other issues like fire safety in space. But at the same time, there were other people working in the group on resources, and over time, that took over the center, and it became what is now called the Center for Space Resources. It's existed for quite some time at the School of Mines, but it has its origin in a research center funded by NASA that focused on commercial applications of combustion in space. So I've kind of followed a path that was we had a goal on doing something in space, but always trying to find the most interesting thing to do at the time, and that's led me here.
And that space resources program, you were a founding member of that, if I'm correct.
Right,
sort of
right. I
helps
mean,
develop that.
particularly the our formally creating it as a graduate program,
Right.
creating our classes, and the entire structure. I'm one of the founding members or founding faculty members of the program. I should say the other thing though that has, what we're teaching has its roots from essentially the dawn of the space age. Even with individuals, particularly the reason there was a lot of space resource activity occurring at the Colorado School of Mines in the early 2000s was a particular professor who came to us in retirement, who was a former NASA planetary scientist. His name's Mike Duke, and he was one of the first curators of the lunar samples that came back from Apollo. He was a young researcher during Apollo, and was a member of the science team in the back room, kind of helping to plan things. And
Incredibly cool.
from that era, the people were already talking about how to expand to a bigger scale, and recognized very quickly that you have to use resources to make it feasible. And there was a lot of work on this through continuously. It really never stopped. And in our program, we kind of link back to all of that to say, we have to. There's a lot of thinking that's been gone into this from decades in the past, and it's still relevant today. Today, there's a lot of new things and a lot of new possibilities because of things like robotics and AI and sensing that that give us new tools that they didn't have to work with back then. But a lot of the methods of extraction of resources and processing are the same as what was thought to be viable back then, and much of it is adapted from what we use terrestrially. So
Very cool.
Yeah.
So, in your opinion, let's come up with an example here. If you were to say pick a location to mine the resources required for Mars colonization, I did some research into the papers you've published in the past, and I realized you published one in 2007 on spectroscopy. Great. Some sort of so I'm hoping that this is in your field. It was basically what technologies would you put on a satellite or perhaps a rover to scan for the resources that we're looking for in constructing homes, supplying the water, basically sustaining a colony of 100
Right.
plus people?
Yeah. So yeah, my I had a period of time in which my research focus was on instrumentation, particularly instruments that could be fly on a lander or rover. Was all focused on actually in situ instruments, that is ones that touch the surface or land on the surface. But I can definitely answer that. So remote sensing on Mars. So on Mars, you need to make a choice about where you're going to get, what resources you need and where you're going to get them from. One of the key resources is going to be water. There are really probably two viable options. Well, there's three. Let's use the third one here. One is, let's just, the obvious one is directly at the poles. There's water ice in large deposits at the poles. The problem with the poles is that is extracting water from the pole and getting it to where you likely have the city, the colony, is very challenging. It'll cost you in propellant. Possibly this is the way you do it. You need to land at the pole, extract water. Maybe you have a mining facility there, and you'd have to launch that maybe suborbital to then land where your colony is. But this doesn't make a lot of sense. You could drive, you could build a pipeline, are all kind of things that don't make sense in the near term for Martian settlement. There's two other options that make a lot more sense. And one is hydrated minerals in some areas of the Martian surface that can be present near the equator. You most likely would situate a settlement near the equator. So that's possible, but you then have to deal with the other things that are going to be present in those minerals, which could be problematic, like chlorine and phosphorus, and sulfur. These are just things that are there in the minerals, and as you extract the water from it, which would likely be by heating, they're going to emerge too. You might be able to find a way that you use those. You probably should always be thinking about, you go after a primary resource, but there are other secondary things that are produced at the same time, and you need to either figure out you have to figure out what you're going to do with that, and if you can find a productive use for it, that's the best. But
wow, sorry, it just sounds like there's so much related to it's like Mars is against us. I mean, is there anything that might be overlooked? I know we're focusing on resources, but is there anything that like normally no layman would think about when associated with colonizing Mars?
I would argue most of it so far.
There's a lot. I mean, it also depends. It depends on what we mean by layman. Somebody who truly isn't up on Mars science and what we know of Mars, and or someone who's has studied this, such as yourself.
I would say someone that is not even someone who coming from a perspective of why are we even going into space at all in the first place? Like, don't we have problems on Earth?
Oh, well, okay, that's a important question to address. Let me finish with the actually best place for water on Mars.
Yeah, please.
And that is mid-latitude buried glaciers. And so you mentioned like what instruments might you fly to better understand resources of Mars that could relate to building a settlement. One would be probably a radar, from orbit radar, on the ground, maybe seismic, that would identify the extent and actual content of these buried glaciers. So in the past, Mars polar caps have been larger. In the past, Mars, actually the pole had been in a different location, where Mars was tilted. The axial tilts varied. And this has created glaciers that at one time would have, polar caps that would have extended across Mars. Sorry, I should say glaciers. Glaciers that would extend across Mars to much lower latitudes than they do today. But there's a remnant of these glaciers that have been found in radar imaging of the surface, and they could be buried by just a few meters of Martian soil. Could be more than a few meters. That's kind of an area of uncertainty, and defining that would help a lot. Then getting a sample of that and seeing just how pure it is and what other things might be present. There'd probably be lots of salts and things like that. That probably is the best place to get water and I'd base your resource use around that, and then figure out everything else from that, including whether you might want to position your settlement near a buried glacier, so the distance from your water source to your settlement is minimized. Okay, so the other things that maybe some who are not aware of much about other issues of Mars, well, there's the perchlorate issue. Essentially, the surface of Mars is not like the surface of Earth. The Earth is our soils are relatively benign to us in most places on the planet. Partly because we have so much water on the planet that everything becomes inundated with water, and that kind of neutralizes the soils. But on Mars, they're in the presence of little water with a low pressure CO2 atmosphere, and this creates an environment where things exist on the surface that don't exist on Earth, and perchlorates are one of them. They're not very friendly to life, and we would have to deal with them to neutralize the perchlorates. So those are that's one of the very direct technical issues.
Yeah. When it comes to the sort of private space industry, what role do you see them playing in the future of space travel?
Yeah, so I would think that private industry would be in most cases, the driver. I think that's what we saw in kind of well, there will be government activities surrounding settlements on Mars and elsewhere. There are specific governments that talk about creating their own settlements, but in a lot of cases, it's kind of private industry, particularly competition among private companies, that would ultimately be a driver. People who would like to go and say try to attempt to be a settler on Mars would you don't just start that on your own. You might find that in time there'd be a company that you would contract with to be a settler, and they would be competing for your business as well with against other companies trying to give you the best deal at getting to Mars and getting you set up and started. In the West, the U.S. West, some of the mining companies and the miners didn't make a lot of money, but the outfitters did. The people who provided the tools and equipment for miners. And this is simply because any individual might fail, but as a group they were all on average successful. So the people selling equipment were more, it was a better business to be in than actually mining in the end, because the risks are high with mining, but it's a little less risky to supply, kind of follow the overall market trend and supply equipment to everyone. So I would think, I think of the commercial sector as being a way to get the best solutions by having a lot of players in the commercial sector attempting to produce the best solution. And some of these will be best, some will be better in some places or in some methods or uses. It might be better than others. And so and that's ultimately, I think that leads to the best solution.
The competition aspect of it's going to sort of drive us there.
Right. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So.
Very cool. So we'll we don't want to take up too much of your time, so we're just going to go with one more final question that we've got. The phrase has often been said, we have the technology to go to Mars. While this may be true, do you think with your work in one major part in staying on Mars, that we finally have the technology to stay there long term? Or do you think that's a little bit of an overestimate?
Well, I think we do have the technology to go to Mars and stay long term. I think we've had it for a while. But there's a big caveat on that. Is saying we have the technology doesn't mean it means we have the ability to create the technology, I think. It's in my mind. It doesn't mean we literally have the technology. It means we are at the point that our science and our technologies have gotten to a point overall where we can conceive of building the tools we need to go there and stay long term. And that's a little different from literally saying we have the technology today.
Right. So to end it out, do you have anything for maybe the regular young kid looking to get into your line of business? Do you have any words for them?
Well, I would suggest always to follow your interests and learn everything you can. One of the things about getting into this is that there isn't a single engineering or science discipline that is sufficient to understand the full scope of this. And actually, I just said science and engineering, but really there's also other fields that are quite important: law and economics and business, just name a few. And so a breadth of knowledge is quite important. In our a lot of our educational systems, we kind of teach two disciplines. We teach, say, my background's mechanical engineering. It's rather broad, but it doesn't touch on, it completely leaves untouched many things. And it's necessary for us to make progress in this field of space resources, or to become an expert on settling other worlds. There is a need for each of us to broaden, to make sure we have a broad base of knowledge, so we're not caught off guard by new findings, or if we focus just on some technical aspect, like this thing about where you might get a water on Mars, and you focus just on one thing and then realize we make a discovery and suddenly, we need to rethink the way we're going to do it. But there might always be a way to do it. So a kind of take a broad perspective and learn everything you can the single discipline is not going to be sufficient. But that's my best recommendation, is to get a breadth of knowledge.
It's good advice. It's good advice for everybody, I think. All right. Well, Dr. Dreyer, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for imparting your wisdom and sharing your knowledge with us. We really appreciate having you on.
You're welcome. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Absolutely.